She wore the saddest eyes in the world on the happiest day of her life, and no one has ever been able to explain it. Look at the photograph. It survives in 100 archives, and you have almost certainly seen it without knowing whose face you were looking at. A girl of 18, sealed inside the most extravagant wedding gown ever made, silver lame, 6,000 pieces of cut diamond, 20,000 feathers catching the pale light of a Tehran winter. At her throat, the crown jewels of an empire older than history itself. Around her, 2,000 guests, an equestrian circus sent from Rome, and nearly 1.5 tons of orchids flown in from Holland. And in the middle of all that impossible splendor stood the most beautiful woman most of those guests had ever seen, wearing a face like a small, quiet grief. The world would spend the next 50 years calling her the sad-eyed princess. What almost no one noticed was that the sadness came first, before the exile, before the loss, before the silent apartment in Paris where she would one day die alone on a date that meant everything. The sadness was already there, sitting in her eyes, on the very morning that everything was supposed to begin. Her name was Soraya Esfandiary-Bakhtiary, and she was born on the 22nd of June 1932 in an English missionary hospital in the ancient city of Isfahan, and from the very first breath she belonged to 2 countries and to neither. Her father, Khalil Esfandiary, was a nobleman of the Bakhtiari, one of Persia's great tribal families, a diplomat who would go on to serve as Iran's ambassador to West Germany. Her mother, Eva Karl, was a German woman born in Moscow and raised in Berlin. So Soraya was 2 things at once, and wholly neither, a daughter of Persia and a daughter of Europe, fair-skinned, with the pale, striking eyes the cameras would one day worship. She grew up crossing between those worlds, Isfahan and Berlin, a school in Switzerland, a finishing year in London learning her English. When she was still a girl, her father was posted abroad, and the family left Iran behind, and she became what she would remain until the end of her life. A person who lived in the narrow space between 2 homes and was fully at rest in neither of them. It is a small thing to notice about someone. In her case, it turns out to be the whole thing. And at exactly the moment she was becoming a poised and quietly extraordinary young woman, far away in Tehran, a king found himself in need of a wife. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah of Iran, was 31 years old and recently divorced. His first marriage, to the beautiful Princess Fawzia of Egypt, had given him 1 daughter, Shahnaz, but no son. And the Pahlavi throne was barely 2 decades old, a young dynasty standing on unsteady ground, and it needed a male heir the way a new building needs a foundation. Quietly, the Shah's family began to look. His sister, Princess Shams, is said to have met the striking half-German girl at a gathering in London and thought her a rare pearl, precisely the wife her brother needed. A photograph of Soraya reached the palace. The Shah looked down at the face of an 18-year-old he had never once spoken to, and he was, by every account, completely undone by it. He did not need much convincing. He arranged to meet her at once. They dined together at the palace, with the Shah's mother watching, and the very next day they were engaged. He gave her a ring set with a single diamond of more than 22 carats, a stone so famous that it is still counted among the great engagement rings of the century. The announcement went out to the world on the 11th of October 1950. Soraya was 18 years old. She was going to be Queen of Iran, and it had all happened in the space of about a week, the way things happen in fairy tales, and the way they happen in the last quiet moment before a trap gently closes. But before the wedding could take place, she very nearly died. A severe typhoid fever put her in bed for weeks, delirious and burning, and the ceremony, first set for late December, had to be postponed while the palace waited to learn whether the bride would even survive to reach it. And here is the detail that tells you how real the love was, and how heavy that same love would one day become. Every single day of that illness, it is said, the Shah came to her sick room and left a jewel on her pillow. A ruby one morning, a little brooch of gold birds the next. Devotion, arriving one gemstone at a time, laid down beside the head of a girl too weak to lift it. He was not performing for anyone. That is the thing to hold on to through everything that follows. That is precisely what makes the rest of it so quietly unbearable. On the 12th of February 1951, still not fully recovered, 18-year-old Soraya was married in Tehran. The gown Christian Dior built for her weighed close to 45 pounds, some 20 kilograms of silver lame, pearls, and 20,000 marabou feathers, with a train that ran on for 20 meters behind her. She could barely move inside it. Snow was falling on the city. The palace was so cold that servants dragged in dozens of wood-burning stoves to warm the marble halls. And when even that was not enough, the court doctor made her wear a plain wool vest and wool socks beneath the silver hidden away so that the shivering would not show in the photographs. And when the sheer weight of that endless train began to drag her off her feet, an attendant was handed a pair of scissors and told to cut the priceless thing away, right there in the middle of the ceremony, so that the bride would not simply collapse under it. That is the fairy tale, seen from the inside, a feverish girl, freezing, propped upright, cut free of her own wedding dress so that she could stay on her feet. Now look at the photograph one more time, now you can see it. The eyes had been telling the truth the entire time. Have you ever been handed everything you were supposed to want, and felt, underneath it, a sadness you couldn't name or explain to a single soul? Most of us have, at least once. If the true human stories behind the glamour are the kind that move you, told with real care and never as gossip, take a moment right now and subscribe. It costs you nothing at all, and it is how these half-forgotten women go on being remembered. Now, back to Soraya, back to the palace, and the 7 years that everyone in the world called a love match, and the one small thing that all of that love could not survive. And for a while, it truly was a love match. Of all the women in the Shah's long and complicated life, the historians who have studied him most closely tend to agree on one point above all the others. Soraya was the one he genuinely loved, the great love of his life, the wife chosen by his heart and not by his crown. For a few shining years, she was radiant in the role. Empress of an ancient land, gliding through state visits and magazine covers, one of the most photographed women alive, watched and admired and copied from Tehran to Los Angeles. She had been an unknown girl studying English in a rented London room, and now the whole world leaned in to look at her. Designers dressed her. Magazines from Paris to New York put her grave, lovely face on their covers. When she traveled on state visits, crowds turned out simply to see the young Empress of Iran in person. For a few years, she was not a person at all, so much as an image, the most beautiful queen on earth. And yet, even at the very summit, she was never entirely allowed to belong. There were murmurs at court about the half-German queen, too European, too foreign, not quite fully one of them. The same in-betweenness that had shadowed her since birth, following her now into the throne room itself. And beneath the Jewin and the banquets, from almost the first year of the marriage, a clock was ticking that neither of them could reach, or stop, or slow. She got an early and brutal preview of how it could all end. In the summer of 1953, when Soraya was 21, Iran plunged into a political crisis so severe that the throne itself nearly went under. For a few terrifying days, the Shah lost his grip on his own country, and the imperial couple fled, first to Baghdad, then to Rome. A king and his young queen turned overnight into fugitives, living out of suitcases in a foreign hotel, not knowing if they would ever see home again. Then the tide turned. The crisis broke, and they were swept back to the palace as though none of it had ever happened. But Soraya had felt the ground move beneath her feet. She had learned at 21 that everything she had been given could vanish inside the space of a single afternoon. It was a rehearsal. She simply had no way of knowing that yet. Because the real danger to her was never a coup, it was something quieter than that and far closer. An heir, a son. Iran's constitution demanded that the throne pass down through the male line of the Pahlavi house, and Soraya, month after month, and then year after year, did not conceive. And then the pressure turned suddenly, cruelly sharper. In 1954, the Shah's own younger brother, Ali Reza, The man who stood next in line, the quiet backup the dynasty had been counting on all along, was killed in a plane crash. In a single instant, the entire fragile succession came to rest on the Shah alone, and on the child that he and Soraya somehow could not have. They went to the finest specialists in the world, in Switzerland, in France, in the United States, chasing hope from clinic to clinic. The private ache of a young married couple became an affair of state, weighed in cabinet rooms and printed in foreign newspapers. Try, just for a moment, to imagine it. You are 23 years old, then 24, and an entire empire is watching your body, waiting and quietly finding it wanting. There is no privacy in a grief like that one. There is nowhere at all to set it down. There was, in the end, one way out that would have let her keep her crown. The Shah could take a second wife to produce the needed heir and keep Soraya on as his queen beside her. It had precedent. In the cold arithmetic of dynasties, it was even the sensible solution. He raised it with her, gently, and she refused. She would be his wife, wholly and alone, or she would be nothing to him at all. She told an American reporter plainly that she could not accept the idea of sharing her husband's love with another woman, that she would not stand by and watch the sanctity of her marriage broken in order to save a throne. It was perhaps the single moment in the whole of her story when Soraya chose her one fate rather than having it chosen for her. And the fate she chose, with her eyes open, was to lose absolutely everything. On the 21st of March, 1958, Nowruz, the Persian New Year, the very day the entire country celebrates renewal and fresh beginnings, the Shah went on the radio and announced the end of his marriage. He wept as he read out the words. His voice broke in front of the whole listening nation, and this is the strange, almost modern cruelty at the dead center of Soraya's life, the thing that sets her apart from all the ordinary tragedies of scandal and betrayal. There was no scandal, no affair, no rival, no crime, no cooling of the heart. He loved her, and he divorced her anyway, simply because a country needed a son, and she could not give it one. She was 25 years old. She was not cast out for being unloved. She was cast out although she was loved. In Soraya's life, the tenderness and the abandonment turned out to be one and the same act. She did not fight it in public. In her own dignified statement to the Iranian people, issued from her parents' home, she said that since His Imperial Majesty had judged a direct male successor to be necessary for the future of the state, she would, with her deepest regret, and for the good of the country and its people, sacrifice her own happiness and consent to the separation. She was 25, giving up the man she loved, and the crown she had very nearly died to wear, and she chose to frame it not as heartbreak, but as duty. Years later, she would put the whole of her life into a single sentence that is almost unbearable in its plainness. Twice, she said, she had been forced to renounce the two things she loved the most, her husband and her crown. She left the marriage as Her Imperial Highness Princess Soraya, the title hers to keep for life, and with a settlement of jewels and property that could have made most of the world dizzy. She kept nearly all of it. She kept everything, in fact, except the only thing she had ever truly wanted, which was him. And so she walked out of the palace and into the second half of her life, the half the world would actually watch. She went to Europe, Paris, the Riviera, Rome, and everywhere she moved the photographers found her, this exiled queen with the impossible face, and they gave her the name that would trail her into every headline for the rest of her days, La Principessa dagli occhi tristi, the princess with the sad eyes. They believed they had invented it. They had not. They had only at long last noticed the very thing that had been sitting quietly in her wedding portrait since she was 18 years old. The name did not describe what the divorce had done to her face. It described what had always from the very beginning been there. And in the country she had left behind, something crueler than exile was done to her for more than 20 years, from the day she departed in 1958 until the revolution of 1979. Soraya was quietly erased from Iran itself. Her image, her name, the very fact of her 7 years as queen. All of it fell under a kind of silence, so that the Shah's new marriage could stand unrivaled and unshadowed. A whole generation of Iranians grew up scarcely knowing that she had ever existed. She had been the most photographed woman in the nation, and now, at home, she was a blank space where a queen used to be. Exiled from the country, and then, more quietly, exiled from its memory. It would take the arrival of the Internet, decades later, for a new generation to stumble upon her face and her story and fall all over again under the spell of the saddest eyes anyone had ever photographed. Here is the detail that turns the whole thing from merely sad into something closer to tragedy in the old, unbending sense. He never stopped loving her either. Long after the divorce, long after he had married a third time and been given at last the sons the dynasty had demanded, the Shah is said to have kept a photograph of Soraya on his desk. He went on writing to her, quietly, and those who knew him best believed she remained the one true love of his entire life. And Soraya, for her part, is said never to have taken off the diamond wedding ring he had given her, wearing it through all the exile, all the decades, all the empty rooms. When the Shah lay dying in his own exile in Cairo in 1980, it is said that she wished to go to him one last time and was never able to. So picture it clearly. Two people who loved each other, kept apart not by anger or coldness or another's scheming, but by an empty cradle and a nation's need, each of them going on, separately, to the ends of their lives, still loving the person they had been forced to give up. It was not a marriage that failed. It was a marriage that was taken away from both of them while it was still alive. She tried, all the same, to build something new out of the wreckage of it. For a time there was talk of a grand return as a film actress. The producer Dino De Laurentiis wanted her to play Catherine the Great, the Empress, which would have been an irony almost too neat to bear. But the project fell apart before it could begin. Instead, at 32, she stepped in front of the cameras in an Italian film called I Tre Volti, The Three Faces, and she billed herself with only her first name, Soraya. No surname, no title, no empire trailing behind it. After a lifetime of being a Bakhtiary, and then a queen, and then a discarded queen, she reached at last for the one identity that belonged to her and to no one else. Just the name. And on that film set she met a director named Franco Indovina, and for the first time since Tehran, Soraya was happy. They built a life together in Rome. He was gifted and alive and devoted to her, and she was, by every account, wholly in love. She was in her 30s now, a woman who had been handed the entire world, and then had it taken quietly back. And here, without any warning, life seemed to be offering her a second chance at the one thing all those jewels had never once been able to replace. Ordinary love, a person who simply chose to stay. She let herself believe in it. She let herself hope again. And hoping it would turn out was the very last thing that fate was willing to allow her. On the evening of the 5th of May, 1972, Franco Indovina boarded Alitalia Flight 112, bound from Rome to Palermo. It was a short flight. He was Sicilian, going home. On its final approach, in the dark, the DC-8 flew into the side of a mountain called Montagna Longa, barely 3 miles from the runway. All 115 people aboard were killed. To this day, it remains the deadliest single aircraft disaster in Italian history. Soraya was there. 39 years old. Her second chance ended in an instant, in the darkness, on a hillside she would never see. And something inside her went quiet after that night, and did not ever fully come back. There is a terrible rhyme buried in her story if you listen for it. The brother-in-law whose death had once turned her childlessness into a crisis of state had gone down in a plane, and now the one man who had finally made her happy again was taken from her the very same way. Twice, the sky reached down and took the thing that stood between Soraya and an ordinary life. After that, there was no third act, no new great love, no reconciliation, no child. She kept an apartment in Paris and moved through the following decades inside it, a princess now, of a country that was itself vanishing. In 1979, the throne fell in revolution. The Shah died in exile the year after. In 1980, that photograph of her perhaps still somewhere among his belongings. And the Persia that Soraya had so briefly reigned over was swept clean off the map. She was, in the fullest and most literal sense that the words can carry, a queen of nowhere. She had her jewels still, the ones the Shah had laid on her pillow and clasped at her throat. But jewels are cold company across 30 years of evenings. In 1991, at the age of 58, she sat down and wrote the story of her life, and she gave it a title that requires no explanation at all. She called it Le Palais des Solitudes, the Palace of Solitude. She had lived in real palaces once, glittering ones, with orchids by the ton and diamonds resting on her pillow. This was the palace she chose to name. The jewels, in the end, outlasted almost everything else. They were the one thing that had never left her. The ring laid on a sick-bed pillow, the diamonds clasped at her throat on that freezing wedding morning, the settlement that had bought her a lifetime of comfort, and none of the things comfort cannot buy. But even they began, slowly, to slip away. As the world she had reigned over came apart, Soraya parted with piece after piece of her legendary collection, and in 1988 a diamond necklace of hers, signed by Harry Winston, went under the hammer at Christie's in Geneva. Picture what that meant. A queen, in her 50s, quietly selling off the last glittering proof that any of it had ever been real. The gems the Shah had once pressed into her hands, one by one, going out into the world to strangers, while the woman he had given them to sat alone in a Paris apartment with the ring she would not sell and could not take off. The fairy tale did not end all at once. It was auctioned away, a little at a time. And when at last she died, even those who might once have been her rivals looked back on her only with tenderness. The Shah's third wife, Farah, the woman who had given Iran the sons that Soraya could not, the woman who might so easily have resented the memory of that great first love, spoke of her, near the end, with nothing but compassion. She said that she had never met Soraya and regretted it deeply, that she had wept when Soraya died, that Soraya had been a part of history and a part of her own family, and of the sad-eyed princess she said something very simple and very true, that Soraya had lived a difficult life, an extremely difficult life. There was, in the end of it all, no villain in this story left to hate. There was only a woman that everyone, eventually, came round to pitying. She died in her apartment in Paris on the 25th of October, 2001. She was 69 years old, and she was alone, and the cause was never publicly disclosed. The date is worth sitting with for a moment quietly, before we let it go. The very next day, the 26th of October, was the birthday of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the man who had loved her and wept and let her go. He had been dead himself by then, for 21 years, and still she slipped out of the world on the eve of his birthday, as though some hidden part of her had gone on keeping his calendar all along, across the decades, across the exile, across every single mile and every long year that had been forced between them. A week later, her younger brother Bijan died too, in the same city, and the two of them were carried far from Tehran to be buried together, in Munich, in German earth, beside the mother and father they had come from. When Bijan had been asked about his sister's death, he had said something that reads like the truest epitaph anyone ever gave her. He said that after her, he had no one left in the world to talk to. And so they laid the Persian princess and her brother to rest at last in the in-between country they had been born, straddling half of Isfahan, half of Berlin, belonging in the end fully to neither of the two, and somehow quietly to both. Go back, one final time, to the photograph. The girl of 18, sealed inside 45 pounds of silver and feathers, feverish and freezing and propped upright, the crown jewels of an entire empire resting at her throat, and that quiet, unmistakable grief already settled deep in her eyes. We call her the princess with the sad eyes, and we tell ourselves the sadness must have come from everything that happened afterward. The weeping divorce, the mountain in Sicily, the erasure, the empty rooms, the palace of solitude she named with her own hand. But it was there, on the very first day, before a single one of those things had come to pass. Perhaps she simply knew, the way that certain people seem to know things long before they can ever say them, that the most beautiful cage in the world is still, in the end, a cage, that to be adored is not, when it comes down to it, the same as being kept. Her eyes were never a premonition. They were only the truth, arriving early, in a face too lovely for anyone to trouble themselves to read it. Soraya, the princess with the sad eyes, she had the eyes long before she ever had the sorrow, and in the end, the sorrow only came quietly at last to match them.